So I'd like to welcome everyone who's joined us. Thank you very much. I know it's a busy time always and lots of demands on our time, but I'm glad you're able to join us today. So as you may know, this is the third series of the global webinar. And this one we've chosen to focus our attention on deconstructing American power and American foreign policy in particular, and trying to put it into a far broader context than the usual kind of policy studies approaches that are taken. And in a way, what we are trying to do is to generate what we're calling a kind of global conversation. By that, we mean there are people in different geographical locations, different experiences of American power, different ideas about it, different attitudes towards it, and different behaviors as a result. But we're also talking about, if you like, the global majority population, which may be located in many different other places as well. And we're trying really to generate a conversation about some big questions like the United States, because where you are, who you are, what you are, and when you are, all matters in the way in which we think about the world and how we are within it. So this series is 6 weeks. This is the second of the 6 weeks. And it's in effect a course over 6 weeks, which if you follow all the way from the beginning to the end, I think you would get a very strong idea about the kind of what we're trying to do, which is about the kind of hierarchical, colonial, imperial core of American power, the pivotal power in the world today, regardless of its relative decline and the change in the distribution of world power. The US still remains economically, financially, militarily, diplomatically, and in so many other ways, still a very, very powerful force. And we can see that in the last several weeks with the outbreak of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, how the mobilization forces of the United States, the coalitions of every type, have virtually canceled Russia, apart from the energy exports, that is, its economy is being as mobilized against by every kind of global system itself. So what we're trying to do is take a kind of very broad approach, which is a challenge to the kind of broadly sort of the conventional mainstream scholarship. It tends to be very narrow. It tends to be dominated by a kind of US-centric position and also global northern perspectives. So this is what this series is trying to do. And as I said, last week we started with American exceptionalism, may call it the kind of bedrock ideology of American power still. Today we're going to talk about racial capitalism and how we may understand it in the American and global contexts. And then next week, actually in a change from the day that we normally meet, we're going to meet next Thursday afternoon at 3 instead of Friday. We're going to talk about race and the building of a white world order. And the following week, we're going to look at the role of violence in the building of American power and the American century. And then following that, we're going to look at the knowledge empire centered on the United States. And then finally, look at the most important kind of strategic relationship in the world today, which is between the United States West and China. So with that, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Juvaria, who's going to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. Thank you, Juvaria.
Hi, thank you, Inderjeet. So for today's session on global racial capitalism, we have speakers with a range of expertise and perspectives on our theme from a global and an American perspective. We have with us, firstly, Professor Alexander Barder. He joins us from Florida International University. His expertise is in international relations theory, international historical sociology, and post-colonial theory, with a focus on historical and contemporary forms of international hierarchy, imperialism, and race. His most recent book is Global Race War, International Political and Racial Hierarchy, published in 2021. And we're also very excited to have with us today Professor Gargi Bhattarcharyya, who joins us from the Institute for Connected Communities at UEL. Gargi writes and teaches on issues of inequality, social justice, and state practices, and has authored and edited several books and articles in the areas of race, ethnic studies, sexuality, and globalization. This includes Rethinking Racial Capitalism, Questions on Reproduction and Survival, published in 2018. And her new book on contemporary mutations of racial capitalism is due to be published by Polity Press in 2022. And our third speaker today is Dr. Mark Ledwidge. Mark is an honorary research fellow at City University of London. His research interests include American studies, race, and foreign policy, and he has several years of consulting experience as well. He is the author of Race and U.S. Foreign Policy, the African American Foreign Affairs Network, published in 2011. Thank you all for joining us today.
And Oz, would you just like to say a couple of words as well as our third co-chair?
I'm Oz Hassan. I'm a reader at the University of Warwick, and I will be tweeting as we go along and sharing your thoughts and what's being said with a wider audience. So
great. Thank you very much, Oz. So Alex, without any further ado from us, please make a start with your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar. I'm really excited to hear all of my colleagues and what they have to say. I want to focus my comments on some of the arguments that I make on in my book. My book called Global Race War, International Politics and Racial Hierarchy, which was published last year, in particular for its implications for understanding US foreign policy. And then I want to finish off with sort of very inchoate points about understanding the racial basis of American imperial ideology, rooted in particular in a notion of frontier expansionism. So I have this idea of looking at Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis and its importance for American ideas about global order and in the 20th century. And so this is something that I'm working on and pursuing for a next project. My book, Global Race War, makes three broad claims that structure sort of the narrative arc of the book. The first is that race and racial violence were crucial to the formation of a global order over a period of 2 centuries. The second claim is that racial violence or warfare proliferated in defense of racial hierarchy, particularly in moments when such hierarchy was perceived to be in crisis. And then the last point is that the racial order continued after the Second World War through the racialization of cultural and civilizational attributes, something that continues all the way to the present. So what I try to show in the book is that since the early part of the 19th century, the very concept of the global was rooted in a racial imaginary. This racial imaginary became a social map that rendered the world in a way intelligible to a Western audience. It emerged out of the crystallization of a political economy based on the Atlantic slave trade that fueled the industrial plantation economy of the Caribbean. As I argue, the racial imaginary cemented itself in the crucible of the Haitian Revolution with the fear and anxiety that racial violence was inevitable between hierarchically incommensurable races. So in the book explores salient moments of from the 19th century to the present, when this global racial imaginary provoked intense, in certain instances, genocidal violence. In our own contemporary politics, concepts such as the Great Replacement reflect a vision of global politics as racially in flux and zero sum. And I think that the continued salience of racial violence in the West, in particular, is the function of this larger global history that I'm trying to tell. Right? So I don't think that we can reduce it, that is to say, this continuation of racial violence, to the particularities of specific settler colonial states, although that's of crucial importance, but it is part of a larger imaginary that continues to take for granted a white world order, but a white world order, as we know, that is dying. So as I said, I begin the book with the Haitian Revolution as this pivotal moment in the crystallization of the global racial imaginary. The Haitian Revolution is an important event in my narrative because it crystallized a proto-genocidal idea of annihilating an entire people during an insurrection, even if the French were unable to implement it. Racial conflict comes to be seen as the condition of possibility for exterminatory violence. The revolution likewise illustrates an inability to not just recognize, but even imagine Black autonomy and political sovereignty in European and American minds. In a painting by the painter Jean-Baptiste Chapuis, Vue de l'incendie de la ville de Cap-Français from 1793, the revolution is portrayed as a volcanic eruption. There is little indication of human agency. Indeed, the effacement of human agency and the depiction of events as akin to a volcanic eruption appear to render the event unthinkable within the Enlightenment imaginary that was imbricated with the Atlantic imperial order. So put differently, the very idea of former African slaves exercising violent agency defied and was anathema to the very assumptions that defined the nascent European global imaginary. Nonetheless, the success of the Haitian Revolution in liberating the island from the attempt at reimposing slavery by the French had three important ramifications. So firstly, as an attempt to solidify white supremacy in the Atlantic Caribbean region by rejecting recognition of Haitian independence until the middle of the 19th century and imposing upon it, by the French in particular, an indemnity that would cripple its ability to sustain its political and economic independence. For during this period of time, Western policies were based on quarantining the Haitian Republic lest it become an example for not only slave uprisings, but a more profound challenge to white supremacy. So furthermore, such policies were designed to construct an international order that reified political and legal hierarchies and exclusions that would benefit Western states. Furthermore, the Haitian Revolution came to be interpreted as a lesson in potential demographic risks to white supremacy. Demographics, immigration, and the movement of people in an increasingly intertwined global order became the subject of imperial and racial anxieties about miscegenation at home, right? And this is something that is deeply embedded in American ideology all the way throughout the 19th century, especially in the latter part of the 19th century, when the United States becomes much greater global player. And there's a lot of anxiety and ambivalence about this American expansionism. And this is something that, for example, Amy Kaplan discusses, I think, quite well in her book. Second, the Haitian Revolution acted as a catalyst for the transformation of the Atlantic political economy from the sugar trade to a cotton-based political economy based in the United States in particular. This subsequently spurred, in the 1830s, especially a settler colonial quest for continuous arable land. And this is something that I discuss particularly in chapter 3 of the book, and the proliferation of enslaved labor. The political economy of cotton and early industrialization would invariably condition racial hierarchy, disciplinary labor power, and the rise of a racialized process of capital accumulation. And this is something I think is quite interesting because it's only in recent years that it's becoming increasingly recognized in the public sphere in the United States, especially with the 1619 Project, which challenges a lot of these sort of narratives about the emergence of the United States and foundation of the United States, especially without taking into account the importance of slave labor in developing the United States, right? And it's something obviously that has become very polemical, at least within the United States itself. Third, and finally, is the notion that race war takes on exterminatory violence or proto-genocidal violence, as I mentioned. Fantasies of genocidal violence were prevalent among the French and their desire to liquidate the enslaved populations, which would run up against the logic of capital accumulation in agricultural production. So the French general, for example, Rochambeau, wrote in 1802, commercial interests may argue that we are destroying all the blacks, the farm laborers, their chiefs, and to use a metaphor, but the legs of everyone else. Without this, we will lose our colonies and any hope of ever having any. Not only did it animate such fantasies of mass murder, but also the destruction of the colony itself. Economic interests could not restrain the impulse of racial annihilation. So I think there's a certain nihilistic disposition in white supremacy that carries over to the present, right? So fears of political, economic, and in particular cultural decline today continues to feed it. And this is something I think Achille Mbembe discusses, where he characterizes this nihilistic disposition as a fantasy of annihilation, where it is preferable to imagine the destruction of the world rather than to reconcile oneself to sharing it with those who were seen as inferior for centuries, right? As Mbembe writes, this fantasy of annihilation is present in every context in which social forces tend to conceive the political as a struggle to the death against unconditional enemies. Such struggle is then qualified as existential, is a struggle with no possibility of mutual recognition or even less reconciliation. This is the struggle that I understand to be race war. So the book is essentially a look at certain salient moments in global history from the early 19th century all the way to the present, through the lens of this notion of racial hierarchy and racial violence. So I want to briefly turn to the connection between this global racial imaginary and the emergence of an American imperial ideology in the latter part of the 19th century. I'm actually teaching over the summer a seminar on US foreign policy. And what I focus on especially is the emergence of and implementation of an American imperial ideology and how it's imbricated with self-representations of liberal democracy. Here, William Appleman Williams's work from the 1950s in diplomatic history is an insightful corrective to the traditional American triumphalist historiography. In particular, his essay, The Frontier Thesis in American Foreign Policy, affirms that at the heart of American ideology about the global lies an imperial expansionism that was articulated by Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. So for Turner, the 19th century American settler colonial expansionism was essential to the formation of American democracy and American individualism. So as he writes, this is a famous sentence, famous paragraph that from his essay, behind institutions, behind constitutional forms and modifications lies the vital forces that call these organs into life and shape them to meet changing conditions. The peculiarity of American institutions is the fact that they have been compelled to adapt themselves to the changes of an expanding people, to the changes involved in crossing a continent, in winning the wilderness, and in developing at each are the progress out of primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life. So I think here, the key here is this idea of winning the wilderness and developing at each area this progress out of primitive economic and political conditions that structures a racial imaginary in American imperial ideology from Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson, and even Franklin Roosevelt in the post-Second World War order. The frontier, in a way, continuously gets reintroduced as a way of making intelligible the necessity of American expansion and intervention. So as William Appleman Williams puts it, Turner gave Americans a nationalistic worldview that eased their doubts, settled their confusion, and justified their aggressiveness. Moreover, as Williams adds, his interpretation did much to Americanize and popularize the heretofore alien ideas of economic imperialism and the white man's burden. Perhaps the latter point is debatable, particularly whether there was always a white man's burden at the heart of the American foundation of the Republic. At any rate, the frontier ideology linked American exceptionalism, economic expansionism, and a mission to remake the global order. In the process, it continuously encountered a racialized alterity at the frontiers of civilization, what another American writer at the time, Brooks Adams, for example, called barbarism. It led some, such as Theodore Roosevelt, to develop a geo-racial view in which global peace meant the effacement of inferior races and geopolitical cooperation among great powers for the sake of maintaining white supremacy. And I should say that this idea in particular comes to be infused in much more anodyne ways in a lot of IR literature. So we have, for example, less overtly versions of this idea where the West represents a Pacific space in the face of a hostile world, and that global order is predicated upon the Western liberal democratic hegemony. And this is something I think that characterizes the work of Eikenberry. Nonetheless, I think that what's interesting is how the frontier is this line between civilization and barbarism that reemerges in American imperial ideology continuously. I would also point to, for example, Richard Slotkin's work, where he draws interesting connections between American westward settler colonialism and the ideology of American imperial violence in Korea and Vietnam. Right? It's not coincidence, for example, that enemy territory was often referred to as Indian country by American soldiers. So Williams argues that Turner's frontier thesis came to make democracy a function of an expanding frontier. And as he writes, in a closed world, the attempt to maintain an expanding national frontier, be it ideological, political, or economic, would lead to war and tyranny. Democracy would be negated. But one can also recognize that the legacies of American political and economic expansion to the present results in profound consequences for the domestic sphere, the perpetration of the national security state, the accentuation of racial and class divisions, the hollowing out of the public sphere, and the legitimacy of democratic institutions. Right? These have been increasingly under threat in recent years, with the intensification of racial populism as the antidote to global capitalism's evisceration of our social landscape. And I think if we want to interrogate the roots of our contemporary proto-fascistic turn, right, then we need to better understand this American ideology of expansionism that essentially comes home to roost. So I'll end it there. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Really quite thought-provoking, and many questions will arise. I just want to remind the audience that please feel free to use the Q&A function on your screens to put in a question at any point. And once all the speakers have had their turn, we'll get to those questions that you would like any of the speakers to address. So please use that function. Thanks very much, Alex. That was really interesting. Okay, we're over to Gargi now for her presentation. Gargi, you have about 20 minutes.
Okay.
So please go ahead. Thank you.
I hope it won't take 20 minutes. And thanks so much for inviting me. And people will understand from the way I speak that I don't work in politics or international relations, but my work has kind of edged over to be on an intersection between your disciplines and my disciplines, so that I've just got a few quite general things actually to say about how we might think of global racial capitalism. And I'll try and say a little bit about what I understand as racial capitalism, actually, either at the beginning or end, because I realise I don't do that. And these slides are really just my own notes, so I apologise for them not being that large, actually. I'll try and make it a little bit bigger. Oh, no, that just says make a comment. Okay. So when I was trying to think about how you might think about US foreign policy in relation to global racial capitalism, I realized that much of my own work around racial capitalism barely thinks about state formations. In some ways, I think the global turn to look at racial capitalism has been a kind of response to an over-state-centered analysis of how racism occurs, for certainly since the Second World War, a kind of over-focus on the racial state and over-focus on the idea that racism is enacted and mediated and policed and enabled by the state. And I think certainly in my view, an idea that there's been a corresponding under engagement with issues of distribution, economics, labor, the whole kind of landscape of the economy side of political economy. So it's kind of interesting for me to try and think, okay, if I was really going to start a conversation again about not only political formations, but the global, the state on the global terrain, how might you begin to think about it? So I just have some glaringly obvious things to say, but they are things I'd like to speak to other people more about. So I hope it's the beginning of a conversation. Firstly, I think certainly from the second half of the 20th century onwards, and probably for longer than that, probably for the period of the Monroe Doctrine onwards, there's this long period globally where US ascendance, I think, has led to a kind of imposition of US racial framing on the global discourse of race. And that goes for different kinds of actors. It's certainly apparent in the ways in which groups who suffer racism in many different places look to the US and the US's model of how you might both think of something like race relations, but also think of something like civil rights and think of anti-racism as their reference point of like how you might articulate your own experience in a very different place. So I certainly think there's what I'm calling an effective identification amongst racially subordinated groups all over the world with communities who are racially subordinated in the United States. And actually, I think much more with the African American experience than with the indigenous experience in the United States or with other racialized experience, although maybe some of that is shifting a little bit as there's more and more of a diasporic conversation, certainly around issues of Asianness and Latinxness in the States. But I think there's a kind of way of imagining your situation as a racially subordinated group in different parts of the world that has for at least a century, probably, if not longer, looked to the States as a kind of model. In more recent decades, certainly think of hip hop, think of the ways in which the racially subordinated across the world use a translated vehicle of hip hop as a way of articulating that, but also think of like things that Robbie Shillian works on, things like the Polynesian Panthers, the ways in which a discourse of Black power then gets translated and reused in very different spaces as the most available discourse of self-organization and anti-racism available globally. But there's also the other side from above, that the so-called sociology of race, certainly in its birth and formation and right up until now, I think, acts as if the US is the main model. That's how you think about understanding what race is, how you use your tools, how you think about what the journey of racialization is. And it has hugely impact on the framing of policy, certainly in Britain, and I think across the world. I've written on my slide that I think the US stands in as a kind of archetype of the racist society in global debates. And that seems like, I wrote it and thought, oh, that's a harsh thing to say, but I do think I think it is actually the case. I think there was a moment during apartheid when South Africa stood in as the archetype of the racist state, but as the racist state that could not survive. The US stands in as the state that is formed in racism, but must always be dealing with racism. And I think it's worth us considering what that kind of sometimes quiet and sometimes loud assumption that the US is the archetype of the racist society, what that does to our own political imaginations, both in terms of understanding what racism is, how it works, how it spreads across different populations and spaces, but also in our anti-racism. What does that squatting in our political imagination of the US experience do to how we imagine what racism could be when challenged? You know, what does it do to our horizon, our political horizon? And I think it does some quite bad things to our political horizon, because the US stands in always as the state that cannot be imagined without its racist formation and cannot really think beyond it. We might come on to talk a bit about how the much greater popularization of abolitionist ways of thinking maybe shifts that. But I would say that until very recently, the squatting in of our political imaginations of the US as the model of what the racist and racialized society is, has stuck us in an impossible reformism, a kind of failed civil rights model, and that we can't think beyond it. But I think there's something happening in our moment. I'd be interested to hear if other people also think that there's something shifting away from that, something around Black Lives Matter, something about the global take-up of an abolitionist model of thinking, which says, you need to start again. There's not small reforms that can be made. The other two things, big two things I had to say about the US and global racial capitalisms were first that thing that the US has stood in as the model of how you think of all racism. The second was how the US so much framed the 21st century's rhetoric and practice around international relations, around the idea of civilizational threat. That in 2022, it feels a bit, because COVID has remade the political discourse, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the whole of the 21st century until COVID was shaped by the idea of the long war, the war on terror, the aftermath of the war on terror that's not yet over, a global framing of something called political Islam, which was always a slippery fish, often used to mean the kind of Muslims I don't like, as a mark of dangerous otherness and a threat to the West. In Britain, there's a quite enthusiastic take-up of that kind of framing of international politics. People in the room will know a very deep investment in remaining the party in a supposed special relationship with the United States, including around these kind of civilizational claims, lapdogs in US incursions into Afghanistan and Iraq, and also a whole making of domestic policy, certainly in Britain and across Europe, in fact, which greatly demonized local Muslim populations and created a kind of whole new machinery of those who are beyond the reach of proper legal process. And in fact, a lot of that still exists because it may be used slightly differently or used less or spoken about less, but that machinery of the word terrorism taking certain actors out of due process in terms of internal legal practice is still in place. And alongside that, no one in the room doesn't know this, that whole take-up of the war on terror quickly extended across actors a rhetoric which was often used in bad faith of containing terrorist threats. We certainly know that Putin has used it throughout his tenure. It's very much used in India and the terrible things that are happening in India right now. And it's used in China in terms of the so-called re-education of the Uyghur people, and it's used in many other places as a kind of almost unquestionable defense of state violence. The notion that there is a civilizational threat, an existential threat from the racialized other who wishes to destroy our way of life. The war on terror kind of spread that all around. So everyone could use that all over the place. And as I've said, it might be less overtly spoken now, but much of that machinery, both at local level and internationally, still remains in place. And then this little bit that I forgot the name of the act, but again, most of you work in this field more than me. But the act that was put in place in 2001 in the States, the authorization for use of military force, which was kind of like, we can go after the bad guys. Anyone who did 9/11, or we think who knew who did 9/11, or who's associated with those people, that suddenly you take away even the small scrutinies of Congress in terms of initiating military action. That, of course, has been greatly used and extended in that 21 years since then, and has not been wrested or taken away. And in fact, now has become the framework through which the US has had so many that we don't even bother to report in UK media, so many overtly military attacks on non-state actors, but within sovereign territories, who often try and complain, but because they're in the global south and poor, have very few spaces to complain. So that has been basically the machinery of global war for the last 21 years. Now we're in this other space of Cold War nostalgias. And I'll just here try and say a little bit more about how I write about racial capitalism, me and others, but often not in the discipline of politics. So quite a lot of the debate about racial capitalism as a conceptual framework includes this idea of how you create and expel a surplus population. So instead of thinking of capitalism as a force that seeks to ultimately capture everyone, because everyone's got some value to get squeezed out of them, there's a differentiation of populations. And some populations are parked, some are left on the border, and some are expelled, or just left to rot because they have little or no value now, or there's more value to be had by leaving some to be expelled. These are the populations who will never be fully included in something like economic development, and on whose expulsion other fantasies rest, certainly fantasies of progress. There's a huge literature about the ways in which settler colonialism renders the indigenous population surplus, expendable, invisibilizable, and and in the end invisible and eradicated in the name of progress. But there's also a whole parallel set of debates about sovereignty, like who cannot be contained within the nation, both through bordering, but also through the identification of those who can never be made fully civilized, a kind of eugenicist shadow. And increasingly, I think, around survival, that debates around how ecological fascism or ecological eugenics really imagines that humanity will survive by rendering some surplus. We can't save everybody because we've wrecked the planet too much. So who will we let go? Racial capitalism is a kind of set of ideas that helps us try to map that process of rendering some people and some groups of people surplus, and trying to work out what the alliances and lines of power are in that process happening. In this really quite scary moment of Cold War nostalgia, we can see once again, after this period that I've just described, where the US could act as if it was the world's sole superpower, and that it kind of changed its own rules in terms of what military aggression against different kinds of actors could be. Now again, we're seeing that the violence of battles for global ascendance being borne by populations seen as being at the periphery. And I think periphery it's one of those fantastical words, isn't it? It's of course racialized. And I'm here saying that racialization is a process, that no single body or community emerges in the world as automatically and fully racialized. To be racialized is to be put in the position of the other, of the surplus, of the disposable, of the periphery. You know, the description of being made on the periphery is itself a racializing discourse and gesture. But it is racializing, and it kind of has a circular process. So the periphery is racialized, to be put on the periphery is to be racialized. And none of this is linked to spatiality. You know, you don't have to be at the edge, but it normally does reflect different colonial histories, you know, different revisitings of the expansionary history of the Soviet Union, what it meant to be non-Russian, a non-Russian state within the Soviet Union, both in terms of where Ukraine is in the imagination, but also in terms of who is fighting Russia's war. You know, all of these online accounts of how many of the very, very, very young boy men who are fighting Russia's war at present are from the very Asian parts of the former Soviet Union. But it's also an active remaking of racialized categories, both ascendant and subordinated. So racialization is an ongoing process of making who has power, who doesn't, who gets to live, who doesn't, who has access to resources and who doesn't. And there's always some movement in that. So we're remaking a kind of ascendant racialized identity. And I wonder if the US's interest in retrieving and rebuilding NATO, and seemingly a kind of model of Cold War geopolitics that half my lifetime we're trying to escape, is also always a racialized referent. You know, it's a kind of white imagination. And that attempted return to Cold War logics, perhaps with a sense of relief, also, of course, and I didn't have time, you know, people in the room might know more, I didn't have time to think about this really. There's something about the relief of being able to resume a more orderly and predictable arms trade as well, and we see on both sides. After a time when the arms trade clearly has remade the globe, but in much less predictable ways. You know, who are the actors, who are the buyers? There's something, you know, you can almost feel the sense of relief, like, oh, if we're going to fight, at least let us know who we're fighting. And in terms of that, you know, the thing that I wanted to hope other people to speak about most, or like indulge me and have a conversation about, is what does that do to the rest of the world? If the 20th century's former superpowers both show a kind of differently constituted but nostalgic looking back at a Cold War, which brutalized the world somewhat differently from what happened after it. What happens to the space of others and what happens to non-alignment? and what kind of perils and jeopardy are in place for other international actors when something like non-alignment is attempted. You know, the famous story that I just wanted to flag up again was after the UN vote, which had this really bizarre motion, even for the UN, about Putin is the devil and we must kill the devil, that kind of thing. Bangladesh and you know, a number of other largely global South nations abstained. I don't think they even voted against. I think they just didn't vote with. Immediately within a day, it got Lithuania, clearly not another big global player, but with its own history. Immediately the day after said, oh, we're not going to, you can die of COVID then. We know you're a poor country, that only half the nation is vaccinated and almost none of the refugee Rohingya population are vaccinated, but you've gone too far now, forgotten your place. And I think there's something interesting in that as the world's great economic and military powers find their feet by looking at each other again. What happens to everyone else in this space where disposability is so easily the first thing to go to? And I hope that makes sense, and I hope other people can speak to this later. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Gargi. That was really thought-provoking, actually. There's a number of different ways of thinking, different conceptualizations, which are quite thought-provoking. And I'm sure we'll raise some questions a bit later on as well. Thank you very much for that. We move on to our final speaker then, Dr. Mark Ledwidge. Mark is a visiting research fellow at City University of London, and Mark, it's over to you. You have about 18 to 20 minutes for your presentation. Mark,
Okay.
you're muted. You're muted at the moment.
I know. Hold on. Let me just load this thing up. Okay, so I wanted to start with just a quick take on US foreign policy and some of the problems around this preoccupation with this good or evil concept that has been mentioned already. The idea that some groups are good and others are evil, and how that has a major negative impact on the way in which people reason and look at foreign policy and international relations. So it's really important to understand that this Judeo-Christian type concept means that you always have opposition, and one side is perceived to be evil and the other one is good. Very basic, but very problematic. So I wanted to look at racial capital, and you can see here, Malcolm X says you can't have capitalism without racism. Now, the key thing to understand is that capitalism was built on the imposition of a power-orientated mode of production based on exploitation and profits. It was constructed as an interest-based system in order to maximize profit for European states. This system combined with race and evolved into white supremacy. And obviously, because I don't have time to break everything down, I'm just running through it. But eventually, this system created a racialized militarism, which became the foundation for an extractive political economy, which was founded on war, colonization, and settler politics. So it's very important to understand the evolution of this system and how race and capitalism are kind of joined together in an unholy alliance, so to speak. So it's important then to look at this concept a little bit further. In short, race and capitalism are symbiotic. Thus, enslavement, colonization, and oppression birthed the construction of whiteness. If you read the work of David Roddicker, he talks about the construction of whiteness and how it evolved over time. Many people just think that whiteness just came and has always been here. No, it was constructed very clearly. Now, historically, whiteness became a form of accumulative capital. that is European states invested in and still receive both symbolic and material power from. So this idea of whiteness then has a capital that is both works within the domestic and the international context. And it's important to understand that it's not the past, it's the present, it's now. Although it evolves into different things, it is still present and is still working. So question, do Black and brown lives matter in international relations? Now, what we need to understand is the relationship between the domestic and international context, and see this in a global way as opposed to domestic in regard to the United States. So racial capital then is a factor in Western politics. One of the important things is not for people to think that race drives everything in US foreign policy. That's not what I'm saying. We're saying it's a factor, and it's often a factor that is neglected. So as I said, question, it is logical to consider, or is it logical to consider, how much do Black and brown lives matter globally within the context of the Western power bloc? So obviously, if you look historically, then it should be clear to anyone who has a clear understanding of global history that Black and brown lives have not mattered in the same way as white lives over this historical period when you look at the ascendancy of the West. So that's important to understand, that when people say Black lives matter, I'm not talking about that in the American context. I'm talking about that within the global context, and how that connection is important to understand what's happening right now in the world. So it's important then to look at situations. Now, it's not good to look at the numbers, but it is important to look at different circumstances that have occurred. And I'm not going to read all of this, but one of the things is when you look at the Darfur situation, which erupted in 2003, the UN estimates the fighting killed over 300,000 people and displaced 2.5 million before it dampened down. So it left a state awash with weapons and tensions that were based around ethnicity, not necessarily religion, maybe a different interpretation, but it's important to understand that. Then in the contemporary context, we've got Tigray. As many as 500,000 people have died from war and famine in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia over the past 16 months. Now, the question is, there are many conflicts that are occurring in the world. And given Inderjeet talked about the global majority, the fact is that the majority of people on the planet are brown and Black people or melanated people. So the question is, do Western powers have a differential response regarding conflict intervention involving non-whites? It's a question that needs to be carefully explored and developed. Okay. So in regards to the situation in Yemen, 233,000 people have died in various circumstances. Now, the UN called that an imminent catastrophe, okay? And it says here, there's an imminent danger of the worst famine the world has seen for decades, okay? So that's really important because, again, we have a famine here. We have this in a region of the world that does not receive the same kind of publicity. So in regards to UNICEF's humanitarian appeal for Yemen, for 2020, they required 535 million, but they received just 237 million, which was a funding gap of almost 300 million. Now, the important thing to remember is how much does this resonate in your psyche? How much attention is given to these issues? These are just two issues that I have really looked at in a comparative way with other circumstances. So I think it's important then to say that capital has value and is a prized possession. What we're calling capital has value. Now, capital in its cultural, economic, racial, and class dimensions is spent in a discriminatory fashion, okay? So in other words, within the international context, in terms of foreign policy, capital is spent in different ways. There's a differentiation in terms of the spending of capital within the global context. Meaning what? That some nations, some people acquire a higher status position, whereby race and notions of civilization yield a higher value. So in other words, it's important to understand, we're not just talking about race, we're talking about civilization, which is often used in the modern context to avoid looking at racial issues. Say civilization because that's cleaner than saying race. But the key thing is here is that some so-called racial groups, some so-called civilizations yield a higher value in the minds, not only of state officials, but in the minds of publics. Okay, so here's a really important thing. So if you look at America, would Biden spend American capital to resolve US racial and class problems? Okay, capital expenditure indicates what you value. So where you spend the money and how you spend it has also a relationship to value. So if you look, you can see Black and Hispanic or Latino households earn about half as much as the average white household, and only about 15 to 20% as much in terms of net worth. That's in the American context. Nationally, African Americans are incarcerated at nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans, though in some states the disparity is far greater. So in other words, non-whites make up a disproportionate share of the US prison population, according to a new study highlighting racial and ethnic disparities among Black, Latino, and white incarcerated Americans. Now, the point here is that if you were to look at this from a socioeconomic perspective, how America spends their money, in other words, the amount that you pay to send someone to prison versus put in programs to stop people from going to prison and to deal with issues of poverty and class, joblessness, that's a major issue. I haven't had time to go into that here, but it's important to understand that in many ways, people in America are more concerned with locking up people than creating a context to end, you know, the rate of incarceration. And if you look at the post-Jim Crow and you look at the writings of W.B. Du Bois, it's very clear that the creation of the prison industrial complex was connected to the end of so-called enslavement. Why? Because you put them in jail and you use them as labor. So you kind of replace enslavement, but on a different level. But I don't want to go too far into that, but it's important that we understand that concept. So this is really interesting because I was scanning the newspapers. Listen to this: blue eyes, blonde hair, racist minds. How Ukraine crisis lays bare racism ingrained in Western societies. Now, think about it. That's supposed to be, this is supposed to be a statement. But if you were to open Mein Kampf and look in it and think about this concept of blue eyes and blonde hair, it has an Aryanist aspect to it that is quite scary. So what does it say here? The reaction of some European politicians, officials, and even journalists not only shows their bewilderment, but also exposes their prejudices rooted in racism. So this is a very real thing. That statement could be in Mein Kampf in regards to what it has been said. But in many ways, people ignore this. Okay, so journalism or racism. I won't go into exactly who said it, but here's the thing. One person said, "It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed every day." Does that mean if the people don't have blonde hair and blue eyes, you're less emotional and therefore it means less to you? Okay, I'm not here to answer those questions because I never said it. Another statement. Isn't a place with all due respect like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized relatively European. I have to choose those words carefully. Again, civilization is put here to suggest issues of race and also issues of power and also empathy, because you create empathy with the group of people by outlining their civilization and their similarities. We are not talking here about Syrians fleeing the bombing of the Syrian regime backed by Putin. No, we're talking about people in Europe. And in many ways, it's important to understand how these statements coexist with previous historical ways of thinking around that. When there are struggles in the South, they can be perceived in tribal ways. It's a tribal struggle, it's an ethnic struggle. But when it's in Europe, it's not tribal, it's not ethnic. But if you look at the nature of the Russian and Ukrainian relationship, then you could read it differently if perhaps people didn't see the fact that they were Caucasian. So Ukraine is a European country. Its people watch Netflix and have Instagram accounts. They vote in free elections and read uncensored newspapers. So they're a different type of people. And the implication there is that if they're different, then we should treat them differently. Okay, so no one would question that Ukraine needs help. And my discussion is not to indicate that I'm pro-American or pro-Russian. It's got nothing to do with that. What we need to do as academics and scholars is to try to be more objective in the way that we look at things, instead of becoming like almost like nationalistic scholars who take a position instead of actually analyzing the situation and seeing the world in the correct manner. So President Joe Biden provides for a one-time $13.6 billion infusion of military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine as it fights back against Russia's invasion. Now, of course, it's already been stated, there is a Cold War aspect here. There is an aspect here that is very dangerous, but I'm not going to go into that here. Then we have a senior Biden administration official told reporters up to 100,000 Ukrainians and others fleeing Russia's invasion of Ukraine will be welcomed to the US. So again, immigration is an issue, but when is it an issue? And who is it an issue for? Because the United States is facing criticism for welcoming Ukrainian refugees after deporting Haitian immigrants back to their homeland. The first scholar talked about the Haitian Revolution and its importance and how it reshaped the world in terms of ending enslavement. That's a whole different discussion, but it's a really important thing to understand that the Haitian people have never been welcomed by white America. And part of that is because of that revolution that frightened people in the mainland. And there's so much more that could be said about the Haitian Revolution, but that's not my subject today. So Europe and whiteness in international relations. It has been suggested that the above have more socio-political capital. So in other words, Europeans and people that are considered to be white have more socio-political capital regarding what? Their racial identity, their culture, their civilization, the amount of economic support they receive, the media coverage, and the empathy. Because empathy is important, because states don't just work from a state perspective. States, especially if you're talking about the United States, what do they want to do? They also want to win public support. How do you win public support? Because you create stories that reflect what side you're backing. And of course, we can have the debate about who controls the media, not here for that. But one thing we can say for sure, the papers in the West, American papers, British papers, have a very, from what I can see, a very clear idea of what's going on from their perspective. Okay. So, of course, then the treatment of Africans. Africans are facing in Ukraine is despicable, but why are we surprised from European news? Africans trying to escape Ukraine were being racially discriminated against. There's so many ways in which Africans were kept off of the trains. At some point, they said it's only women and children. And then when the African women women and children tried to get on the trains, they were not allowed on. They were kicked off numerous times. There are many stories which I couldn't include because this has to be a short presentation. But what is very clear that the relationship between the Ukrainians and the Africans in this instance has not been good. And let's say some Ukrainians. But here's an important thing to remember. Putin claimed that there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine, which is true. There are neo-Nazis in Russia as well. Russia doesn't have a good history around neo-Nazis. But here's one of the things that's really important. There is a whole undercurrent of race and racism that exists in Ukraine that most people are not seeing in the newspapers. And that is key, because what we're actually having is a form of empathy. I'm making it up right now. Empathy censorship, meaning that you write what makes the group that you're projecting on seem right and not deserving of the behavior of the aggressor. It's very important to understand this. And again, as I said, this is not an indication of support of Russia. What we should be doing as political scientists is understanding these issues as they unfold, because they will have a major impact on global relations. So there's an issue. Why have African leaders not being as zealous in terms of calling Russia out? So at the UN General Assembly, Resolution 17 African nations, abstained, almost half all abstentions, and one voted against condemning Russia for its aggression and demanding a withdrawal from racism. Now, here's the thing. African leaders have called out the West for having double standards, but also for pushing NATO eastward. Because again, if you look at it, what was the Cuban Missile Crisis about? What was it about? How did America respond to having people they consider to be enemies close to America? Again, so you have to read history correctly to understand the security situation here. I've almost finished, Inderjeet.
Okay.
So the important thing here is this notion of double standards. But also another issue is the legacy issues in the West's racial capital among non-white nations. You see, you've got to flip it the other way. It's not just racial capital in terms of people of color. How do said nations of people, and remember the global dynamics are changing, how do said people look at the West in terms of its racial capital? How is it perceived? So Biden has says we have to do our part. He's calling for 33 billion in additional assistance for Ukraine. Question, is America a war economy? How was capitalism created in the first place? You know, if you look at concepts like karma, they say as a thing started, so it ends. If it started in violence and it started in war, and if it started in oppression, then that may be its very undoing. And I'm referencing here the United States. So last thing to consider, how much racial capital does the West have globally, right? How much? Because Russian soft power in Africa and Chinese soft power in Africa is a threat to the power of the United States. You have other nations, India, Iran, Pakistan. You have this concept now where people are looking at the issue and not necessarily jumping to the American position. So really what I'm trying to say here is that in relation to racial capital, there is a surplus and a deficit. The question of what groups of people have a surplus or a deficit, it will not be a constant. That will change over time in relation to changing power relations. And the fact that you can spend 33 billion, or you want to spend that amount of money, what are you going to do to that economy? Because when your economy begins to suffer, then what will the American population begin to say about what you're doing? So we're actually living in a very dangerous time in history where, although we say we're in the 20th century and assume that we've grown and we've progressed in many ways, we seem like we're going backwards in terms of our thinking. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mark. That was also very wide-ranging, actually. But you had kind of dug deep pillars into some really seriously interesting ground as well. So we're going to, obviously, we've got 3 questions already in the Q&A. Please feel free, members of the audience, to write in more of your questions into the Q&A. I'll open up the Q&A now for the first question, which is from our regular, Sean Stars, one of our colleagues in the department. It's for you, Alex. And Sean asks, do you think the primary driver of American imperialism is white supremacy or the expansion of capital? If the former, then why would the US allow Japan to rise? And why would the US support many non-white dictatorships around the world? So it's kind of race versus kind of power or class. It seems to be at the core of this particular question to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great question. I don't see them as necessarily antagonistic drivers of American imperialism. I think they work together, and part of what I argue in the book is the extent to which racial discourse is extraordinarily malleable, right? It can change in terms of its focus in defining who is the enemy and who is not, right? And so the case of Japan is really interesting, right? Because beginning in the early part of the 20th century, right, there's a lot of discussion in the United States about as part of this larger discourse of the yellow peril, right? Asia is rising. So writers such as Alfred Mahan, who's known for his books on sea power, is primarily concerned about this idea that the 20th century threats are going to coming out of Asia, right? And so Japan takes on this representation of threat, right? This is happening at the same time where the United States is beginning to close its borders to Asian immigration into the United States. You have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so all the characteristics of threat and anxiety, of racial threat and anxiety, are centered on Japan, leading up, culminating essentially in the Second World War. After the Second World War, then Japan takes on an entirely different position as an ally in the Cold War, right? So it's no longer seen as a threat, right? And then if we fast forward to the late 1980s, early 1990s, right? Japan then, I'm old enough to remember when Japan was seen as a threat, particularly an economic threat, right? That the Japanese were going to take over the US economy, right? And so there was all this sort of racialization of this return to a kind of racialization of the Japanese as this threat to the United States, right? And the same thing certainly happens with China, right? Which is that in the 19th century, China is seen as this weak power. It is unable to enter modernity. That sort of begins to shift after the Second World War, where China becomes, obviously because of the Cold War, China then becomes seen as increasingly a threat to in its communist machinations around the world, right? And all of that is also deeply racialized. It's interesting, for example, in 2019, there was a meeting in Washington, right, where the Trump administration official by the name of Kyron Skinner, who's a professor, I think, of international relations, and I forget where exactly, made this incredible argument where she says China is a civilizational threat, right, essentially a racial threat, right, because they're not Caucasian. Whereas the Soviet Union, right, the conflict with the Cold War with the Soviet Union was a family affair, essentially, she says, right, which is a remarkable rereading of history, right? Because the entire sort of discourse of early Cold War United States was that the Soviet Union was this Asiatic power, that it was this Asiatic threat, right? This is a point that, for example, George Kennan makes. So I think the point is the extraordinary extent to which this racial discourse of threat, anxiety, is sort of adaptable to different political contexts, right? But it's always present.
Thank you. And reading recently literature on the so-called Japanese threat in the late 80s, early 90s that Alex, you very importantly referred to. The rhetoric is so similar to the kind of rhetoric used today or in the more recent past in regard to China as well. So that this is more than just an ordinary competitor. This is something extraordinary. And there's that kind of very deep, important racial element to it. And Karen Skinner, yes, Professor Karen Skinner, who was the head of the policy planning staffs in the State Department when she said this, is an African-American herself, as it happens, yet has this whole sort of racialized worldview, which he's willing to say in an open public conference. I just wanted to kind of, that same question, or the basis of that question, which Sean asked, I'd like to ask Mark, because you had the quote from Malcolm X at the beginning of your presentation, and then you kind of explicated it, amplified it a bit more. But this whole thing about race and class, and to what extent do they interrelate with each other? And clearly in your definition, where you looked at capital and you subdivided capital into its economic, cultural, racial, and class components. And I just wondered whether, do you feel the need to differentiate class from race, or do you see it as something which is kind of so interwoven? And is it even necessary, therefore, to engage in that old, it's quite an old debate, isn't it? Class versus race and so on. And I just wondered if you wanted to just pitch in, Mark. You're muted, Mark.
Sorry. Okay, so that's a really important question. And I think one of the problems with the discussion is that people kind of take it to extremes. Race and class can exist together, and they do exist together. However, the differences in class, let's say within the domestic context of the United States, an African American may have a middle class or upper middle class in terms of their financial identity and that kind of thing, in terms of the job they do, they're a professional. However, that doesn't mean that they escape the racial oppression that African Americans or people of color who are in the lower class divisions, they actually have to recognize that there is a relationship between the two, but your financial or economic class does not mean that you escape the racialization process. I was thinking of Henry Louis Gates, or you could even think about Obama in terms of the treatment of Obama. You can say he was a president of the United States. Yes, he wasn't physically attacked because of the Secret Service and things that they did, but we both know that he had more Secret Service and earlier because of the number of attacks that were threatened against him. And secondly, when you look at the way in which people spoke about him as the president, there was a very clear issue around race. I don't see the need to say that one exists and the other doesn't. They both exist, but how that interplay can be negotiated based around other factors. So it's very important. What I said in my statement, and remember that was a statement made by Malcolm X, not me. I'm not Malcolm X. He said that he doesn't think that racism, capitalism can exist without racism. Whether it does or not is something that we have to look at very carefully. But one of the things we can say is that modern capitalism was started by European nations. And in many ways, non-white nations were often pushed into capitalism via colonization. Okay, and even if you think about the rise of Japan, the rise of Japan comes after the Second World War, after it's essentially been destroyed, and then America comes in, aids Japan. So what's the point of that question? It doesn't mean that race will always be the trump card, but what it means is that it will be a factor. So that is why when we look at Japan and China, the rhetoric is similar, because now that China becomes a threat, its racial identity is amplified. So there can be an amplification of your racial identity, or it can be lowered in accordance to how you perceive as a threat within the domestic and global context.
Yeah, and it's interesting also that when we look at the First World War, for example, and that Germany passes out of Western civilization into barbarism, rhetorically. It is then treated as outside and a destroyer of Western civilization. And the others are, the allies are the sources of restoring Western civilization. And so in a way, those categories become very significant, even if the race of the other party is the same or very similar to one's own. So that kind of, that civilizational barbarism rhetoric is very, very powerful. I think, I mean, Alex, you raised the issue about 1619 and the 1619 project. And that seems to have caused a lot of controversy among American historians, and a fair number of schisms appear to have developed. I wonder if you want to just say something about that, because that seems to prioritize race above all else in the understanding of the making of the American Republic itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an extraordinary 1619 project. I think is an extraordinary reevaluation of sort of the mythical foundations of the American Republic, right? So it's not just a controversy among historians, right? It's obviously an enormously important polemic to redefine what it means, what America means, right? And that's why it solicited enormous political pushback, right? So for example, I live in the state of Florida. The state of Florida has been for some time now a deep red state. The politicians in the state of Florida are pushing significant legislation to preclude, for example, the teaching of the 1619 project, the critical race theory, right? Anything that sort of calls into question the sort of mythical foundations of the American Republic, right? Once you tackle that, once you sort of go against that, it solicits a significant political pushback. We saw that, for example, in the 1990s in the case of Israel, right? Where the new historians have called into question sort of the mythical foundations of the state of Israel, right? And that created a kind of counter-revolution, and that's what we're going through as well in the United States, right? And as I said, we're feeling it. I'm feeling it myself with the kind of the barrage of attacks and legislation that's happening across the United States.
Sure. It's a major mobilization for the elections, really, isn't it? With the banning of, I mean, I've been reading about the banning of 40 school children's textbooks, including maths textbooks, which have virtually nothing to do with race or racial equality or anti-racism or anything like that.
That's happening in my state, right? The banning of math books,
yeah.
right?
Yes.
That has nothing to do with race, right?
Yeah. Sure. Thank you. Sean has asked another question of Gargi this time. He's asking really whether or not you think that the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, made any real difference in the end after it, being the kind of largest protest movement in American history. Despite that, the elections have thrown out people who have effectively sort of acted against the Black middle class and so on and so forth before that. So I just wonder, what is your kind of take on that question that Sean asks?
Firstly, I don't think we've even begun to understand what the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement is, because this is a whole generational shift, and a generational shift that I don't think we can comprehend the widespread engagement with the Black Lives Matter movement amongst younger people, not only in the States, but across Europe and across the whole world. So that's kind of sifting through. I do think we're seeing out of the Black Lives Matter movement and other associated movements, even more of a sense of the crisis of electoral politics, not only in the States, but here and actually across Europe again. Look at what the French presidential election was like again, and there seems such a huge mismatch, and COVID only made that even more apparent between what the official structures of states do and pretend to be in their electoral formation, and how people can live and die. So I think Black Lives Matter, I think if someone's going to write a history of the 21st century, the first quarter, if you were going to say in the first 20 years, you'll talk about the war on terror and Black Lives Matter as two huge moments, and then pandemic. And I think you can't tell in one electoral cycle, which is the same machinery, what that impact has been. I think really people understand that. It's just we don't know yet what will happen. And a whole generation starts to understand in very overtly anti-capitalist ways how very broken the systems of political representation we have are. I feel very optimistic about it.
And actually, you know, what you're saying, there's a project at Princeton which is looking at the quantity of people, the proportion of the population which was on the march, actually actively protesting on the street. I think they calculated it was something like 17% of the American population, and it was spread right across the country, which is actually an incredible number of people. If you think about the population of America being about 330 million, nearly a fifth of the people. And of course, we've got.
And then when you age scale that,
yes,
it becomes very much greater when you go into
correct.
age range, doesn't it? And again, you can see echoes of that in Britain and other parts of the world where there's solidarity protests, and also protests again about state violence that are inspired by Black Lives Matter. That doesn't all just get put back in the box easily, I think. So everything to pay for. Sure.
And I think with the upcoming midterm and then 2024 presidential elections as well, and the continuation of what the GOP is a far right, extreme far right political party, which has a strong chance of both holding on and increasing their strength in November this year, and possibly returning to the White House with or without Trump. Where they govern in the United States, they govern as if the election was stolen, that protest is illegal, and boundaries of electoral constituencies need to be redrawn, and certain people to be restricted from voting in various kinds of ways. Gargi, I just want to stick with you with something that you said in your talk towards the very end, when you talked about what does all the kind of Cold War nostalgia and so on do to the rest of the world? And you raised the issue about non-alignment and the global South. And I just wonder, and Mark raised the issue of the responses to the Ukraine sanctions on Russia towards the end of his talk as well. To what extent do you think that there is an entity or consciousness called the global South, which has some kind of common consciousness and an idea of common action and common interests, that it can be a greater actor in the world today, as it may, the spirit of Bandung and non-alignment and the new international economic order, G77 and all that. Do you think there is a sort of an emergence of some version of that kind of tendency worldwide?
I'm only laughing because I was thinking to myself when I was writing my slides about Cold War nostalgia. I'm obviously a Bandung baby with Bandung nostalgia, and there's a whole kind of global generation who are whose families are forged in that moment. Clearly, the term global South, it doesn't capture the structures of global politics or global economics anymore, does it? If it ever really did. But the emergence of global South superpowers, and also a great shift in just where the center of the global economy is, makes a difference. However, I have to quieten myself, without having too much Bandung kind of nostalgia, I do think the idea of non-alignment should have to be differently framed. And non-alignment, even that's the wrong phrase, isn't it? But you can feel it, as people have said today, there's a kind of, why is there so much overplaying of what's happening in Ukraine? With every sympathy in the world, with Ukrainian civilians who are being displaced, given what we have seen every month, every year for so many years of people being displaced. And I think that there's a shift in global consciousness around, you know, when is it a global issue, when it is it not? And what is what is the table anyway? So this is also part of a battle about whether those UN structures have any validity or usability again. And so partly what we're seeing with even non-abstention is an attempt by players who, you know, that whole movement retake the UN as a meaningful global table. And within that, what would it mean to not let the big highly armed kids call all the shots? I think that is a very interesting and urgently necessary question for lots of us, isn't it? And, you know, I understand it won't be the same. Of course, it can, you know, things don't replay in the same way, but non-alignment is still my best word for now. And perhaps what we'll see is the emergence of a different language of geopolitics, where something better than the term non-alignment for watching big arms dealers fight each other.
Sure. We've got a question for you, Mark, again from Sean. Thank you, Sean, for engaging so well. Mark, Sean says that now that capitalism is firmly entrenched around the world, and especially in East Asia, is it still possible to argue that capitalism cannot exist without racism? Can Japanese capitalism exist without white supremacy? Are we reproducing Eurocentrism by assuming that all capitalism is Western capitalism?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. But again, I think there's two things to understand. I kind of touched on it previously. Where did capitalism come from? So the foundations of capitalism, very clear. System of enslavement, triangular trade. It's clear to see what happens. Now, that means that the creation of surplus for Europe and America and even the Anglosphere was created on exploitation, which fed into the evolution of whiteness and race. Okay, so that's nobody in their right mind would argue that point. The second point, though, is that with colonization, when Europeans went into other countries, in many cases initially, they created the context to create capitalism among those groups of people. And at this point in time, people have chosen to maintain capitalist structures. However, if you look at the history of the 20th century, we can see that that wasn't just by chance. There was also a major, proxy wars that occurred around this whole thing, communism and capitalism. For me, I'm not fixated on capitalism. You could be communist. Let's take the Russians, for example. The Russian territory in terms of the people, Asian people, but when you look at the leadership of Russia, the elite leadership, they're white, and they have been white. So that doesn't mean that racism doesn't occur in a communist situation. Racism is racism. It occurs. It can be in communism, it can be in capitalism. The key thing to understand here is to what extent can the West operate continually with capitalism when the world begins to try to change its ideology? Because one of the things that you have to understand, that by becoming capitalists, you then gain power by which you can then begin to negotiate the way in which the West behaves towards you. And I'll say this within the American context. You were talking about the shift to the right. Some of the reasons why there's been a shift to the right is because of the American demographics. It is very clear when you look at US demographics that the white population is in a decline, which many people say that is why they have shifted to the right in an extreme way. So what I'm saying here is that as you get demographic shifts, both in Europe, I've heard the term genetic winter said in terms of Europe. You have the same issues in America. You're going to see more of this rightist turn, more of this racial exceptionalism, because there is a fear among the white population that they are actually in danger. So you actually have to flip it differently. We're just talking about race in a very simplistic way. which I don't believe it works that way. It is plastic. It is plastic. So the basic thing here is that just because people in Asia take up capitalism doesn't mean racism doesn't exist anymore. What it means is they've adapted to a system that they see in the modern context that allows them to compete internationally with other groups. Now, one last point on racism, that doesn't say that people within Asia don't have issues around so-called race and ethnicity. Remember, race doesn't exist, but doesn't mean that people in Asia don't have issues around so-called race and ethnicity within their own context. So I think you cannot oversimplify it. I didn't say that racism just lies with white supremacy. I said that that's where it came from. That those are the groups of states that created it, but they are still living off of the surplus of what they have done. And also, if you look at a state like France, the amount of money it takes from Africa, okay, that racism is still here. So we can't talk as though racism has disappeared. It's here and it's now. And that's why Black Lives Matter Black Lives Matter is not the group called Black Lives Matter. It's the response to the idea of Black Lives Matter, not the group, not the leadership. It's the group.
Thank you, Mark. Alex, you have your hand up. We don't have much time left, but the last word with you.
Yeah, I was just going to say this. I mean, Mark raised some interesting points, and one of the things that I found in my research as well is the extraordinary extent to which there's an internalization of Western ideas of race in non-Western settings, right? So we see this in Japan, for example, and the adaptation of scientific racism in various contexts, right? Japan, the Ottoman Empire, right, which leads to extraordinary forms of violence, right? The one issue that I want to raise, though, is an issue that's raised oftentimes by Afro-pessimist writers in the American context in particular, is whether there's a fundamental difference between anti-Black racism versus other forms of racism, right? Because for Afro-pessimists, anti-Black racism is ontological, right? It is the foundation of modernity, right? Whereas, for example, Asiatic racism or racism against others is much more plastic or much more malleable, right? So they can be accepted in the West, but there's always this sort of ontological chasm between Black racism, right? And I was wondering, if Mark or others in the panel how do they feel about that as well? Because it's sort of mixed feelings about that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually.
I don't know
Michael,
if we have time to discuss. That's a whole other issue. But.
Well, I mean, yeah, we can actually. But Michael Hunt, in his book Ideology in American and Foreign Policy, talks about the extermination, enslavement, and sort of exclusion, so that you do have those kind of mechanisms set up in different ways. And I guess what differentiates the different populations that you referred to is the manner of their arrival. The manner of the arrival. That seems to be the sort of badge or the mark, which really then sort of confers a certain degree of status. And around the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, there were debates about how indigenous African Americans, as indigenous to the United States, had fewer rights than non-white immigrants from other countries. And so there was this sort of differentiation. And I wonder whether it's the manner of the arrival, it's the voluntary or non-voluntary, involuntary character of the arrival, which is what confers that status, which then has repercussions following. I wonder what Mark might say about that. You'll get the last word now, Mark. We are now over time, and people have things to do and so on, but you're muted at the moment, Mark, if you'd like to say a few words.
Okay, yeah, so that was a brilliant question. I think it's very complex, so I'm going to give you a very short answer. The reality is, Inderjeet is right. The way in which you arrived is a factor, but also understand that the creation of race, the model for race is Aryan. It was an Aryan model, even though most Europeans don't have the so-called Aryan features, right? But this Anglo-Saxon model of race, there is the degree of differentiation between you and the model. There's a correlation between that and the way in which you're treated. So in other words, the darker your skin complexion, the more problematic you are perceived from a racial perspective. So in other words, some people, as Rodiger said, some people who were not considered by Benjamin Franklin, for example, he said Italians weren't white at some point, Polish weren't white, right? But they can do what? They can become part of the American society based on the fact of their colorization is a lot less. Whereas with African Americans or people of African descent, the darker you are, the greater the issue. And you can even look at that in terms of studies about who gets killed by the police. The darker you are, the greater force in terms of the way the police act. So it's not really just about how you arrive, it is about skin colorization. That is a major aspect of race. And that is why, sorry, I can't remember my colleague's name, but he made a brilliant point about the internalization of race. Remember, race is not just done to the other internalizes race. So therefore, people in Asia can be racist to people in Africa, etc., etc. So that kind of racialization, in other words, white supremacy does not just belong to so-called white people. It can become part of somebody's very makeup. I, as a person of African descent, could perceive myself from a white supremacist standpoint and hate myself. That's why Du Bois talked about double consciousness. So it's a lot more. There is a lot more to this than the kind of surface discussion about skin color. It's actually how has your mind been affected and infected by race. So many of those societies, even in Japan, you'll find, and in places like Korea, you'll find that people change their eyes in order to look more Caucasian. So these issues are very deeply rooted in the psyche of the individuals who have been projected on by racists.
Thank you for that, Mark. That's really very interesting. We have to call it time now. We have gone a bit over time, but it's been very worthwhile. I want to thank everyone, Gargi and Alexander and Mark, for giving up your time and for illuminating so many different questions. Next week, we meet, as I said, on Thursday at 3 p.m. London time, not the Friday, for various reasons. And we're going to talk about effectively race and whiteness and the making of a white world order with another lineup of very, very interesting speakers as well. So I want to thank Deirdre for her technical prowess and getting us through this webinar today. Fantastic, well done. And
very welcome.
Thank you. And I want to thank Oz and Juvaria as well for making these webinars possible too. So thank you everyone very much. See you again soon, and hopefully next Thursday at 3 for another really interesting panel as well. Bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye. Well done, Deirdre.
Oh, you're welcome. You'll be relieved to know it's not me next week.
No, well done. I mean, I think it's one of those things that after 2 or 3 goes at it, you get habituated to it. So
yeah, I'm sure if we do a few more.
Yeah, I mean, it only took in the end about 4 or 5 minutes of, fiddling about. So
exactly.
Yeah, so very good. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Inderjeet, always.
Thank you.
All right.
And thanks very much, Oz and Juvaria as well. Have a good weekend.
You too, Inderjeet.
Yeah, and we have to kind of make sure we tweet Thursday for next week, right?
Thursday, yes. Remind them about Thursday.
Yeah. Just so that we have to remember ourselves as well to turn up on Thursday.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
See you guys.
All right. Thanks very much. Bye.
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 Bye.